David, Damien, and Marisa are only two representatives of MALDEF staff, present and past, who come from the LGBT community and represent their views in our staff. Again, there are many who would argue that our two communities, which are overlapping communities, again, when I talk about two communities, I recognize that our communities overlap in significant numbers, and that for those who are members of both of these communities, the issues of discrimination and bias that they face are oftentimes multiplied because of their membership in both communities. And I cannot go on in talking about two communities without first acknowledging that reality for so many in the Latino, Latina, and LGBT communities. There are many who would argue, as I've mentioned, that our movements have significant differences, but tonight I want to focus on some strong similarities between the Latino civil rights movement and the LGBT civil rights movement, because these are the bases of our strong and ongoing partnership and collaboration. I identify 5 significant similarities. First, in both of our communities, with respect to many members, many of the members of our communities continue to have to live in silence and in the shadows about their status. In the Latino community, I'm talking about the significant undocumented Latina community. In both of these communities, these members live in secret and daily deal with anxieties about what revealing their status as a member of the undocumented Latino community or the LGBT community might mean to them. And this anxiety extends not just how community members, particularly those hate-filled, talk radio listening members of the community, but also anxiety about whether law enforcement will step up and do what their job is to protect people regardless of their status in either of these communities. There was a time when an undocumented member of the Latino community had a primary fear about deportation. Regrettably, with a substantial increase in hate crimes against the Latino and Latina community, often these hate crimes accompanied by anti-immigrant epithets and slogans. But because of that increase, now the anxiety extends also to a very real fear of violence and hate crimes being perpetrated against them. That is a commonality between our communities that is a regretful manifestation of why there is a need for both of these movements, but it is a basis for our continued cooperation. A second similarity is that both of our communities face the phenomenon of folks who would characterize us as single-issue movements. For us, they assume that once comprehensive immigration reform is taken care of, that we will go away. For the LGBT community, they assume that once marriage equality is finally secured throughout the nation, that your movement will go away. But in truth, we know that both of these movements are durable and enduring movements for true political power that would influence public policy decisions on every element of society and throughout our nation. Third, a much more recent example of similarities between our movements. We both face forces in Washington and elsewhere that would seek to discount us in the 2010 census. For the LGBT community, the continued refusal to ensure that there is accurate, reliable data about the extensive presence of the LGBT community throughout every region, every state, every county, every city in this country is an ongoing injustice. In the Latino community, we face a similar phenomenon. Recently, fortunately defeated, U.S. Senator David Vitter proposed that we add a question. They go after us by adding a question on citizenship to every census form. The one and only purpose of that proposal was to deter Latino families, many of whom have mixed statuses within them, from filling out census forms. And though it was defeated, we know that the Vitter Amendment is a precursor to arguments that will be made, that if you are undocumented, you should not count at all for purposes of apportioning congressional seats or redrawing legislative lines throughout our nation. Make no mistake, this issue of being discounted in the census is a very serious, serious concern. Going back to our country's beginnings, one of the most deplorable elements of our Constitution when it was adopted in the late 18th century was the inclusion of a provision that counted certain persons based on their status as slaves and based on their race as only 3/5 of a human being for purposes of congressional apportionment. We fought a civil war and enacted constitutional amendments to eliminate that deplorable provision from our Constitution, and now we face forces in both of our communities that would seek to do the same in the 21st century, discounting us to 0/5 of a human being for purposes of apportionment and otherwise. That is a similarity upon which our partnership should build. A fourth similarity, our two communities, our two movements are victims of the deficit in Washington, D.C. I do not mean the budget deficit. I mean the courage deficit in Washington, D.C. For the LGBT community, the continued failure after over a year to do anything to reform or abolish the deplorable discriminatory practices of our U.S. military is an example of the courage deficit. Abolishing this discrimination requires nothing but political courage. Similarly, in the Latino community, the refusal to move to date on comprehensive immigration reform, despite promises during the 2008 campaign, despite the Latino communities providing votes for the victory that so many of us justly and rightly celebrated, is a lack of courage. We too are victims of the courage deficit. Finally, and you'll forgive me for going back to my lawyerly roots, the similarity between our communities is that significant portions of our community have been outside of constitutional law for far too long. I had the privilege several years ago of teaching a course at the USC Law Center. It was about civil rights litigation. And whenever we would go over the cases that came to the right progressive result, but that could not be squared with existing doctrine of equal protection because they were decisions that refused to acknowledge that undocumented immigrants or members of the LGBT community are suspect classifications that should be accorded every protection that other discrete and insular minority groups have been accorded for the last 50 years.